Hey.
Annie and I are in London again. It's another grey day. Chilly. Just the weather for a woolen vest, which I've been wearing on this trip. Annie liked mine so much, she bought one for herself the day before. We've been spending so much time reporting this story together that we're even starting to dress alike. But I noticed she isn't wearing hers today.
I'm not.
Oh.
Why not?
Well, I just thought with black it was a little bit too stark.
Do you want to worry about clashing with
You mean
me
you and
in
me?
my vest?
No, if anything, I wanted to match. We could be a reporting team with our uniforms on. I'll wear it tomorrow.
On the agenda for today, visiting my old neighbour and family friend, Charles Pinelli's. Nice to see you, Charles.
Nice to see you.
How are you? You might remember Charles. He's the definitely not a neighbourhood gossip who set this project in motion. The one who first told me about the 3 different families experiencing a ghost on the top floor of my old house.
Anyway, you're going to bring us up to speed, so this is a very big deal.
Well, I think we're going to start with some questions, if that's all right, and then I'm going to bring you up to speed.
I'm not sure it is. I think this is blackmail.
If you eat your vegetables, you get your dessert.
I didn't keep him waiting for too long. I told Charles that we'd been in touch with the American family who moved in after me.
Can I tell you something, Charles? We've found the Americans.
Oh, well done. Oh, that's the best news.
And they have 2 daughters.
And specifically their daughter Sonia, the woman we talked to last episode, whose bed shook violently.
Ah, that's brilliant.
But really, I was here to talk about the 3rd family, the one who saw the faceless woman. You'll remember that Charles met the mother of this family years ago when he knocked on the door of my old house and she answered. She told him that her daughter had been complaining about seeing the faceless ghost at night in my old bedroom. The mum said she'd always brushed it off, never taken it seriously. And you'll notice I'm not using any of their names here, because months into reporting this, they were still refusing to talk to me.
I got in touch with the daughter who slept in the room, the daughter of the mother that you spoke to. We had a phone date this morning, and then the mother found out that I had contacted the daughter and intervened and basically said...
At this very last minute?
Her mother intervened yesterday evening.
Here's what happened. After Charles told me about this family's experience, I called the mum, asking to be put in touch with her daughter. She wasn't ready to yet, but she was warm, seemed as intrigued as I was. So I kept in touch, sent her updates. Then things took a turn.
She had not answered my calls, or she'd given me an elusive response by email, or she had ignored my messages.
Yeah.
And then she ghosted me.
So eventually I just reached out to the daughter, said if there's any time she wants to talk. She agreed to speak with me. And within 45 minutes, I heard from the mother. And the mother said, "Do not contact my daughter. We are not interested in what you are researching." And I tried to explain myself a bit more and to just say, look, I've been trying to communicate with you and I never heard anything, so I contacted your daughter.
Who's also in her 20s. Like, she's not a 13-year-old.
She's an adult. She's an adult.
She must be 23 or 4 by now anyway.
Frankly, it shocked me that she was so upset that I'd reached out to her adult daughter. I'd clearly touched a nerve.
That's what I find very interesting about this, Charles, is when I first learned about this story, my initial reaction was that this was fascinating, but I was quite sort of lighthearted about it. But as we've kind of been digging, we've discovered that it's not a lighthearted curiosity.
It's not so funny, no.
I'm definitely feeling it's less funny than I did at the beginning. There are people who slept in that room who it seems are pretty traumatized by what they experienced, which is not what I expected when I started out on this process.
The mum's reaction was particularly confusing for me. I get not wanting to participate. I understand not believing in ghosts or thinking this is a silly project. What I don't understand is why me reaching out about a ghost would make her so angry.
So that's where we are. And, I'm not discouraged by this, because for me, it reveals that there is something quite disturbing which is happening on the top floor of that house, which is something that I strongly suspected already, but now it's really crystallizing this idea that people on the top floor of that house are experiencing something which has frightened them.
It's certainly fascinating. I mean, that is quite extraordinary.
I reached out to Sonia, the woman who described her bed shaking in the last episode.
Yeah, I can't wait to find out what's the latest.
I wanted to know what she thought about the other family's reaction. And the mother was like, "We don't want to participate in what you're doing. Don't contact me. And don't contact my daughter."
Oh my God.
What do you make of all that?
Oh yeah, the mum's having a reaction. So by you contacting her, she's basically, you're affirmed that the daughter's feelings and experiences are kind of accurate, basically.
The reason we wanted to talk with Sonia is that the mother's reaction reminded me of Sonia's sister, who'd initially been interested in speaking and then abruptly shut down and refused.
I was quite surprised that she wasn't up for speaking about it. But she's always been more sort of... I'm not uncomfortable with the fact that there are paranormal stuff or ghosts or beings or other dimensions. I'm open to that. So, but other people who are very just skeptical would not feel comfortable talking about it because they have no compartment to put that experience into, and therefore they just want to erase it. So when you bring it up, they feel uncomfortable because it doesn't fit into any of their belief scope.
And it's almost like validating that it's true, which would be even
because
better.
they'd have to change their beliefs, and lots of people don't want to change their beliefs. They want to keep them the same, and so anything that doesn't fit, it just gets discarded, and you can't talk about it with them because they just become uncomfortable.
That seems...
I think that
seems true.
Reason.
Sonia, thankfully, was happy to keep talking. I finally told her about the murder in the house next door, and there were some things from our first conversation that I was hoping to understand better. But then she told me something that surprised me. When we talked, you gave us the story of like the bed shaking.
Yeah.
And then you said that when the bed shaking stopped, you had this very kind of strong feeling in the room. I was just wondering if you could walk me through what that feeling was.
Obviously, it felt scary because it was an unusual situation to be in. But the feeling in the room was just that I was being watched for about 5 minutes. And I got, in my mind, I was like, this feels like a male energy. I feel like his name begins with, I don't know, that's just his name begins with a J or something like that.
Okay, it's really weird that you say this about the name starting with the letter J, because there is someone whose name starts with the letter J.
Oh.
Faither's first name was John.
Oh my God.
From Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios, this is Ghost Story. I'm Tristan Redman. Episode 3, The Locked Door.
From Wondery, I Hear Fear is a new anthology series of suspenseful stories hosted by Carrie Mulligan. These stories are inspired by true events in real places, so the next sound you hear could be your own scream. Stay tuned to the end of this episode to hear a preview of I Hear Fear.
There's a roughly 20-year period from the end of the First World War to the beginning of the Second that's known as the Golden Age of detective fiction. It's hard to say why exactly people were going so crazy for crime novels. Certainly part of it was that it served a kind of collective therapeutic purpose. The trauma of World War I was so unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. And what these novels promised in their small way, was that order could be restored. Logic could triumph over mystery and confusion. Things could make sense again. In the United States, there was Raymond Chandler, but most of the big names were British. Agatha Christie, G.K. Chesterton, and a woman named Dorothy Sayers, who along with Christie was known as one of England's Queens of Crime. Dorothy Sayers wrote 16 crime novels. They were hugely popular. By 1937, when my wife's great-grandmother is murdered, Sayers is a household name in Britain. She's just published a new novel. In it, a man is found murdered inside an old house. All the windows and doors are locked from the inside, with no evidence of a break-in. A classic locked room mystery. Just like what my brother-in-law Hugh Dancy was talking about at the end of our last episode.
It's when somebody dies inside a locked room.
Is that a thing?
Yeah.
The puzzle of the locked room is what nagged at Jackie Moulton, the Scotland Yard detective. If Father did kill Naomi and Morris Tribe, how do you explain the crime scene?
The problem with it is to work out how Tribe ended up on the lavatory floor and it's locked from the inside.
How would Father have exited the bathroom to then break down the locked door from the outside? In December of 1937, less than a month after Naomi's murder, Dorothy Sayers is at home when she receives a call from a man she doesn't know.
Right, so is this Miss Dorothy Sayers, the writer?
Who is that speaking, please?
Dr. Dancy of Richmond.
Dr. Dancy of Richmond. That's Father, of course. And the conversation that followed, Sayers found it so strange and unsettling that she took detailed notes, essentially a transcript of the call, and immediately sent them to Scotland Yard. So we're going to read it, excerpts of it, like an old-fashioned radio drama. Hugh agreed to play Father again.
Right.
Annie will be playing Dorothy Sayers.
Turns out my British accent is terrible.
And off we go.
Is this Miss Dorothy Sayers, the writer?
Who is that speaking, please?
Dr. Dancy of Richmond.
Oh, yes, doctor, what is it?
Well, I know your books. You're interested in crime and so on.
Yes.
Well, my wife was murdered a few weeks ago, and I thought you might like to come and see the place. It's quite a problem.
Good heavens, well, thank you. I'm afraid detective writers are rather stupid about problems in real life.
Oh, there's nothing to solve. That's all being cleared up. But I thought you would be interested in hearing all the details of the investigation. There's a great deal more than ever got in the news of the world. Did you read about the crime?
No, I don't think I did.
Oh, well, it was a very complicated business. My brother-in-law, he'd had a head wound during the war and was a little unbalanced, shot my wife and tried to shoot me, but I escaped by flopping down and pretending to be dead.
I begin to remember the case now.
I thought you might. I thought it would interest you and help you with your work. You are interested in this kind of thing, aren't you?
Very much, but I'm only in town for a few days.
Come to dinner tomorrow night and I'll show you everything and tell you all sorts of details you wouldn't get from the police.
Just stop there.
Detective Jackie Moulton will be reprising her role as interrupter, stopping us whenever she hears something she wants to comment on.
You're only less than 3 weeks after his wife died. He's calling Dorothy Sayers. Because the first thing that you can imagine, if your wife's been murdered 3 weeks, you think, oh, do you know what? I'm going to give that to a crime writer.
So, back to the call with Sayers. Father has just invited Sayers to come over for dinner and tour the crime scene. She tells him that she's busy, but she could come over after Christmas.
All right, well then, if you'd like to come and have a talk about it after Christmas, I'll just give you a few more details to whet your appetite. You are interested.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very much. That sort of detail is most useful, but this must have been very terrible for you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm rather a philosopher in these things.
A few details to whet your appetite. From here, Father does go into a lot of detail. Detail you don't find anywhere else in the police file.
He'd planned it all out a long time before. He tried very hard to persuade me to buy a razor of a suitable sort. He couldn't use that kind himself because he only had one eye. So he persuaded me to buy one for myself. Then he took a lavatory towel to hold the revolver. He thought that the absence of one towel in the lavatory wouldn't be noticed. He shot my wife, and then he shot at me. The shot was fired from about 14 feet. They can tell that, you know. Did you know they could tell that? Well, then his idea was to make it look as though I had cut his throat. It was very carefully planned, a long time before.
Stop. These are totally new facts. Read that bit again, can you?
Well, then his idea was to make it look as though I had cut his throat. It was very carefully planned, a long time before.
So, this is new information. He's not told the police that, has he?
Yeah, this is not something that was introduced in the original statement.
Right. The whole idea of him as
Yes.
suspect is coming up for the first time here.
Yes.
I want to spend another moment on this, because the logic here is kind of stunning. What Feather is suggesting is that Morris intended to kill himself, encouraged Feather to buy him the right kind of razor to do it, but was planning to do it in such a way that it would look like Feather had killed him. Because according to Feather's logic, Morris, after he was dead, wanted to pin his death on Feather.
It sounds like one of those complicated crimes that one only thinks happens in books.
Oh, it was a regular storybook crime. He was a fellow who was always reading books, detective stories and that kind of thing.
I'm afraid we tell people too much in our books.
Yes, ha ha ha. I'm afraid so. It was obviously a murder taken out of a book.
Stop again. If I was to speak about the book, can I speak about the book? So the police do recover some interesting items in Tribe's room. They find some methylated spirits. They find cocaine. They find some photographs of nude women. And they find a book, fictional book called Murder in the House. So it's almost like a bit of a Cluedo game, isn't it? That these items are conveniently, in the room.
To clarify, it's in Morris's room that police find these seemingly incriminating items: alcohol, drugs, pornography, and a book called Murder in the House. Feather says that Morris loves reading crime novels, but he's also reporting that Morris is losing his eyesight.
Dancy talks about the evidence that Morris could hardly see. He'd lost one eye and the other eye was failing. So then he tells police he read these murdered books all the time. And then he's saying he could hardly read. He can't see. So he's hardly an avid reader, was he?
Back to the phone call.
And then we got the police, and of course they had to go into a lot of questions in their usual way, so keen on the wood that they couldn't see any of the trees, to show that I hadn't done it myself. They had to be sure I hadn't cut his throat myself and got out through the lavatory window and then broken the door afterwards. Then another point, there was blood on all four walls of the lavatory, but there was no blood on me, and there were no blood stains or marks on the window where I might have got out.
Just stop there. Is he saying to say actually what happened?
What do you mean?
Can you read it again?
Yeah.
They had to be sure I hadn't cut his throat myself and got out through the lavatory window and then broken the door afterwards.
He's telling Sayer, this is how I did it. That's how I read that.
Jackie's suggesting that in this conversation with Dorothy Sayers, Feather may have been outlining the answer to the locked door mystery. Feather would essentially be saying, if I'd done it, well, I'd have had to have climbed out the window, come back into the house, and then knocked the door down.
I'd like to know, for example, where that lavatory window is and how, is it on a flat roof? Can you access the ground?
So what would you want to do? You would want to go and see that window?
Yes, everything. I would want to go and see everything, yeah.
We have seen the window. Would you like to see a picture of it?
Yes.
Okay. The window opens out on the left side of the house. It's high, 25 feet or so. Too high, in my opinion, for someone to scale or jump down from. But Jackie immediately notices something.
So he could scale down the drain pipe.
There's a drain pipe that runs underneath the window and then down the house to the ground.
How easy would a drain pipe be like that to scale down there?
No, that's not difficult, would it be? That's what burglars used to do, didn't they? Go up and down drain pipes, yeah.
As far as why Faither called Dorothy Sayers to tell her this, Jackie has another theory.
So he's actually saying they're missing stuff, is he not? That's what I got from it.
How do you read that? Like sort of gloating?
Yes. Gloating.
I thanked him again, and I said I was sorry I couldn't come Thursday, but might possibly manage Friday.
Friday? Oh yes, come Friday. Only of course I shall have had to put back some of the things. For instance, I must put back the bolt on the lavatory door. But I can show you most of the things and we can have a talk about it. If you come Friday, don't give your real name.
Not my real name.
No, my daughter's coming home and she's read your books and would recognize your real name. She's 14 and she doesn't know anything about all this yet.
Very well, if I come, I'll use my married name, Fleming. I'll let you know if I can manage it. Then he gave me the address and telephone number.
That must have been a surprising phone call. Yeah, he plows on, doesn't he?
When the transcript of the conversation between Faither and Sayers landed in the hands of police, the case was already closed. The last official document in the file is a letter from the police to Dorothy Sayers responding to her memo. They acknowledge that the call is curious, but they tell her basically, don't worry about it. The responding officer writes, quote, "I feel certain the case will never be reopened."
Poor old Morris Tribe, his whole character destroyed. He's remembered as the man who killed his sister. I don't think he did.
Ever since talking with my wife's Uncle Mark, I've been trying to take his warning seriously. Don't be sensationalist. Remember, this man is beloved by much of the family. But when you line up all of Jackie's concerns and try to make sense of this bizarre phone call, it doesn't really feel irresponsible to go along with her hunch. Frankly, it feels like Faither got away with murder. Coming up, I do what any in-law investigating a murder in his wife's family would do. I get a second opinion.
I'm about to play a clip from I Hear Fear. Follow I Hear Fear on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Shh. Stay quiet. Don't move. Did you hear that? Sounds you hear in the middle of the night. Or when you're deep in the woods. Or alone, walking down a dark street. You tell yourself it's just your imagination. But what if it's not? From Amazon Music and Wondery, I'm Carey Mulligan, and this is I Hear Fear, a new anthology series that will make you bolt your doors and hide under the covers. My favorite thing in the world is a brilliant ghost story. And nothing scares me more than a story inspired by real events and real horrors. From a deadly dance party to a cursed movie set. The sounds of terror are all around us. Warning, the next sounds you hear might be your own screams.
Binge all episodes of I Hear Fear ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts.
Convincing as Jackie was, I couldn't go to my wife's family and tell them Father committed murder based on the opinion of a single detective. So I need to get a second opinion on the police file. Due diligence, dotting I's, crossing T's, etc.
Hi.
Hi, Hamish.
Hi, Tristan.
Hamish Campbell retired from Scotland Yard after 39 years, but he used to be basically the murder guy in London.
I was head of homicide in the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard, in charge of the 26 murder teams which operated across London.
He investigated murders. He ran the teams that investigated murders. He ran the teams that investigated the way police were investigating murders. He's seen a lot of murder. So I started with the obvious question. What would be your one-sentence headline from reading that police file for the first time?
I would say it was quick, but correct.
What do you mean?
Well, the investigation was done very quickly, phenomenally quickly. Do I think the observations and findings of the investigation were correct? Yes, I do. I do see it as murder and suicide.
And what do you mean by a correct outcome?
Well, I understood why it was murder and suicide, and I can see from the investigation that was done how that would be the outcome.
If as you say, if you can't tell, I'm pretty flummoxed here. I have to be honest that you kind of caught me off guard.
I noticed.
Because right before speaking with you, we spoke with another homicide detective who had nearly the opposite interpretation of the police file, and that the crime was most likely not a murder-suicide, but a double murder. So what do you make of that disparity?
Well, I'm not sure. I'd want to know who the detective was who came to that conclusion. But the premise that somehow the doctor murdered his wife and then murdered his brother-in-law doesn't stand up, in my view. I don't see that at all.
Hamish is focused on a piece of evidence that Jackie was much less bothered by.
The detective, how did they address post-mortem report?
The post-mortem report. He sees this part of the file as the closest thing to something scientific.
You know, the post-mortems are so critical. Have you never been to a post-mortem, have you, Tristan?
I have not. The doctor goes in, examines the bodies, and writes down what he sees. In this case, when he looks at Morris's body, his neck in particular, the doctor concludes that Morris most likely killed himself. I just want to give a quick warning here again. We're going to get into some graphic details.
And when I looked at it, I sort of broke down the pathologist's statement where he talks about the 3 wounds are indicative of hesitation and trial.
3 wounds indicative of hesitation and trial. The pathologist calls these hesitation wounds. Hesitation wounds are common in suicides by this method. They essentially show the person working up the nerve to go through with it. The cuts on Morris's neck seem to show this. The first 2 are shallower and smaller. The third is fatal. And this pattern, the pathologist said, is consistent only with suicide. You don't see these kinds of wounds in homicides.
That is the indicative piece of evidence. I don't know how the other officer examined that and thought, I will completely disregard the pathology evidence.
I wasn't prepared to take Hamish's word for it. He isn't a pathologist after all, so I called one.
I mean, the evidence screams, medical evidence screams to me, homicide, suicide.
From pathologist Tom Andrews' perspective, the hesitation wounds are conclusive. Morris killed Naomi and then himself. But I asked him if another scenario could be possible. Perhaps Father knew that hesitation wounds were typical of suicides and was able to mimic them precisely. He's a doctor after all.
I think given the nature of these hesitation wounds, those are exceedingly hard to fake. I have been a forensic pathologist for many, many years, and I'm not certain that I could fake hesitation marks as cleanly as this.
And for Hamish, the faking hesitation wounds line of inquiry is borderline ludicrous.
He's had to kill Tribe and make it look as if it's self-suicide because he might know what hesitation wounds look like, and he's done that and there's no other error. Yeah, I mean, you'll forgive me, but that's where the argument goes down rabbit holes.
There's another piece of evidence Hamish points us to that supports the murder-suicide verdict. It comes from Morris's sister-in-law, a statement she wrote to the coroner. In it, she writes about Morris.
I always thought it was a possibility that he might commit suicide. He once told me that if he killed himself, he would cut his throat and that he knew where it should be done. So that's where I'm starting from. So I'm afraid for me, he committed suicide.
If Hamish is right and Morris committed suicide, then the chances that Father killed Naomi are slim. His account of what happened that night would hold up. With this evidence as the backdrop, the rest of the suspicious stuff that Father does seems like no big deal to Hamish.
Have people been murdered for their insurance money? Of course they have.
The insurance policies, for instance.
Of course they have, all over the world. But it's not like it's suddenly taken out. The other one's expiring and they've upped it. And the reason it's up is for both of them. So he's protecting both himself and his wife. I don't see that as a reason to go and murder her.
As for Father's bizarre behavior in the crime scene, like when he washes Morris's hands and then moves the razor from the floor to between Morris's fingers.
That is an odd thing to do, but nevertheless, I don't see it as necessarily suspicious because he needn't to do that at all. It's almost so what? He did do it. It doesn't change the story.
And then, of course, there's the phone call to Dorothy Sayers less than 3 weeks after the murder.
You don't know about people in high trauma, post-event catastrophe, how they react. He's the victim of a terrible crime in his house, you know.
Maybe he's just freaking out.
Yeah, people can behave irrationally.
Armed with the hesitation wounds, Hamish is able to write off the inconsistencies one by one.
I don't write them off. They exist and they're present, but I don't interpret them as evidence that Dancy killed his wife and his brother-in-law.
In general, Hamish's calculation comes down to an Occam's razor theory. Whatever scenario is most likely is probably the correct one. Who's more likely to have killed Naomi? Her disturbed brother who was struggling with PTSD and alcohol? Or her husband, a respected doctor?
In the circumstances of this household and what we know about Tribe, his injury, his, is it a mental disturbance of some sort? I mean, years of post-war disability on drugs, medication.
I did a little digging around on this topic, and the stories from this era are horrifying. This is 2 decades after World War I. The newspapers frequently ran stories of former servicemen doing terrible things to themselves and others. I spoke with a historian who's written extensively about the effects of shell shock on British society after World War I. She told me a strikingly familiar story. Her own great-uncle, a shell-shock veteran struggling with depression, one day out of nowhere slits his girlfriend's throat and then his own. The story Father tells about Morris may not have been that unusual.
So someone murdered the wife, the husband, or the brother. There's no evidence to show that it was the husband who killed his wife. Could he have done it? Of course he could. Everything has possibilities, doesn't it, in murder? Do I think with all the other material and the background to the case and the way they lived their lives and who they were, I think it's extremely unlikely.
So where Jackie saw a locked door mystery, Hamish sees a locked door.
To get the door lock broken, he's had to kill Tribe, lock himself into the toilet, climb out the window. I mean, it's becoming a bit fanciful by now. You have to deal with what's more likely and probable as opposed to what's unlikely and improbable. Is it impossible that he did all these things? No. Is it likely, though? It's pretty unlikely.
After our call with Hamish, my head was kind of spinning. I thought I was just going to Hamish as a formality,
After talking to Jackie, the gaps in the case seemed glaring, and I was so focused on how I was going to tell Kate's family that Fader might be a murderer that I just assumed Hamish would have a similar read. And now we had a very different problem, with two extremely qualified detectives giving us completely opposite verdicts. We had to figure out which one of them was wrong. So...
Okay, my name is Dr. Alfred Titus Jr.
I'm a criminal behavioural analyst, formerly of New Scotland Yard.
We got a bigger sample size.
I'm a professor and criminologist. I was also a police officer and detective for 16 years.
Retired NYPD.
I'm just going from my 27 years of working cases.
We assembled a kind of informal panel of 6 murder detectives with decades of experience. And what was your solve rate?
The last 3 or 4 years, we were at 100%. We had 100% solve rate.
It was about 95%.
I'm not trying to brag, but it's pretty damn good.
Actually, I did some maths. Between them, the panel has a collective 174 years of experience.
I can sit here and tell you I solved all of my cases, but one, and I'm going to sit here and tell you I had 2 divorces.
We sent them the file and asked them for their assessment. And they all had the same answer. What would you say is your one-sentence headline after having reviewed the case file?
Dr. Dancy did it.
Dr. John Dancy has a clear motive.
For me, there seems to be only one person who does gain in this scenario.
I would say he was absolutely involved.
And that's Dr. Dancy.
Every single one came back with Fader as their main suspect.
Nobody knows for sure but John.
I believe it was homicide by Dr. Dancy.
They noticed things we didn't see in Fader's statement.
First of all, I went into it with no preconceived notion of whether it was a murder-suicide or a double murder. But when I read his statement, I knew it was baloney. That's when I knew he did it.
This is Cloyd Steiger. He was a homicide detective at the Seattle Police Department. One part of Fader's statement did it for him. Which part of it?
Okay, here it is. Dr. Dancy hears the shots. Tribe shoots at him. He says he went to the lavatory and tried to open it. He called on Tribe to come out and give him the gun, but he replied, "Stand away from the panels or I'll shoot you like a dog." So he did all that first. Then he went into the room. She's dead there. He found her on the bed, shot through the eyes, blood spurting from one of them. That's his exact words. There's a legal term for phrases like that.
What is it?
This is bullshit. This is all bullshit. Because, first of all, like a shot to the head, a brain, you're dead almost instantly. It'll spurt for about 3 seconds or 2 seconds. So when he says blood was spurting out of her right eye, bullshit. He did not see that. That's an absolute lie. Let me change it. He may have seen it, but if he did, he was standing right next to her when he fired the shot, when the shot was fired. That's the only way he could have seen that. No other way. 0 chance. That is a physiological fact.
The panel pointed out problems that seem obvious now.
To be looking at a gun that was supposedly on the floor next to Maurice, you have a gun and you have a razor, and you're going to kill yourself. Who the hell would pick up the razor and cut their throat?
Like, they all doubted that Morris would have used a razor blade to end his life when he had a revolver with 3 rounds left in it.
So there are firm stats on preferred method of suicide by age, by gender. Slitting one's throat is less than 0.5% of all suicides.
You don't see people that cut their own throats. Not one time have I seen it. Not one time.
The truth is, this point stands whether Morris killed himself or Fader killed him. Why would Fader choose this incredibly difficult way of killing Morris if he had a gun right there? Why would he slit his throat? The detectives had thoughts about that too.
He might have killed Tribe first, because his wife was asleep and you could do that quietly. Whereas if he shot her first, Tribe would go running and, what happened, you know?
There's something curious about this scenario though. If Fader had attempted to kill Morris, Morris would have fought back, and you'd expect to see defensive wounds, bruises, nicks on the arms or body. But there's nothing of the sort. Only the wounds on his neck.
That's the other thing. I want to know what the toxicology was. What was Tribe's blood alcohol level, right?
Unless, of course, the detectives pointed out, Morris was knocked out. In fact, several of the detectives wanted to know whether Morris had been incapacitated before he died.
There's no toxicology report.
Even though the technology existed at the time, the pathologists didn't do a toxicology report on Morris. Maybe because they didn't suspect anything.
So we don't know if Dancy, shot him up with morphine or any other kind of drug to incapacitate him. And him being a doctor, he's got the wherewithal to do a lot more than a regular Joe could do. He's got drugs, he's got medical knowledge.
Remember Fader mentions in his statement that he was giving injections to Morris to treat his failing vision? He gave them to him every Monday, the same day the murder happened. This all seems pretty suspicious, but we hadn't yet talked about the one piece of evidence that Hamish thought overruled all the others. I want to ask you about the hesitation wounds, because that was kind of a key piece of evidence for the pathologist.
He described them as hesitation wounds. Were they hesitation wounds or were they attempts to cut his throat? Because when I first heard this, to be honest, when I read the first things, I just scanned through it and then I saw hesitation wounds. Oh, hesitation wounds. Yeah, it was probably self-inflicted. Then I went back and read the whole thing in depth and looked. That doesn't really sound like hesitation wounds to me.
Cloyd disagrees with the pathologist at the time, and he just thinks the wounds are too deep to be hesitation wounds.
Because hesitation wounds generally are very like a scratch.
How do you know that?
I know how hesitation wounds are because I've seen them several times. But in the skin, because it's hesitation, once you start cutting into the skin, it's not really a hesitation wound anymore because that hurts a lot.
The so-called hesitation wounds didn't move the needle for Cloyd, and none of the other detectives even brought them up. So, if we got this panel together to get clarity, I guess we got something close to that. Here were 6 new detectives wholeheartedly agreeing with Jackie, and Hamish way out on a limb on his own. For those of you keeping track at home, that's 8 detectives we've spoken to, 7 of whom point to Fader as their main suspect. But despite that, I didn't feel a lot of clarity. Hamish's point about the hesitation wounds was nagging at me. I wasn't so sure it could just be rejected so quickly. And the pathologist, who insisted hesitation wounds would be virtually impossible to fake, he said one thing in particular that stuck with me.
You don't see that kind of planning and delicacy trying to fake hesitation marks. I don't even know who would think of that. That's awfully diabolical.
Actually, this is one of the only things that all the detectives agree on. For Fader to have killed Naomi and Morris and staged the crime scene, he would have to be sort of the perfect criminal.
If that's the case, we're talking about, a clinical psychopath.
He played this through like a cinematographer. He probably thought about it every day and he thought of the perfect crime.
And Fader? What are the chances he's secretly a criminal mastermind?
What kind of person was Dr. John Dancy?
Well, that is a very good question, and it's the question that I spend almost all my waking hours thinking about. So, Dr. John Dancy is my wife's great-grandfather. He's a doctor. During the First World War, he becomes a spy. Oh, yeah. Did I mention he was a spy? Why'd you make that noise?
Because he knows stuff. He's trained in this type of stuff.
What type of stuff?
Like getting away with murder.
That's next time on Ghost Story. Follow Ghost Story on the Wondery app, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at wondery.com/survey. Ghost Story is a production of Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios. It's hosted by me, Tristan Redman. Our lead producer is Annie Brown. Our senior producers are Chloe Prasinos and Jess Hackle. Our producers are Zandra Ellen and Emerald O'Brien, and our associate producer is Natalie Pett. Joel Lovell is our editor. with fact-checking by Maximo Anderson. Theme song and music by Daryl Griffith, supplied by APM Music, with mixing and original music by Hannes Brown. Pineapple's head of sound and engineering is Raj Makija, with assistant engineers Sharon Badales and Jade Brooks. The senior audio engineer for Ghost Story is Davey Sumner. Jess Hackle was our senior producer of development. Our artwork was designed by Brian Kluge. Legal services for Pineapple Street by Rachel Strom and Sam Kate Gumpert from Davis Wright Tremaine. Crystal Tupia at Odyssey and David Hurst from 5RB. Our senior producer for Wondery is Michelle Martin, with producers Brian Taylor White and Grant Rutter. Rachel Sibley is the managing producer for Wondery, and Sarah Mathis is the coordinating producer. Our executive producers at Pineapple Street are Maddie Sprung-Kaiser, Max Linsky, and Jenna Weiss-Berman. Our executive producers for Wondery are Morgan Jones, Rich Knight, Marshall Louis, and Jessica Radburn. And special thanks to Richard Quinn, Chris Potter, Susie Grogan, Damian Allen, Alison Vermeulen, and Barney Lee, as well as all the detectives on our panel. That's retired US homicide detectives Christine Menina, Cloyd Steiger, Dr. Alfred Titus, and Wendell Stradford, and former detective, now criminologist, Michael Arntfield, as well as Laura Richards, former criminal behavioral analyst and domestic abuse expert for Scotland Yard. And special thanks from me to the memory of Richard Moore. This episode contains public sector information licensed under the Open Government License version 3.0.